So in 1.2, we're talking about one of the guiding principles of economics, and that's supply and demand. So supply and demand is really trying to answer this question of how do manufacturers determine how many of an item to produce and sell, and even going farther than that, what price? Right? What price can we sell these items at to try to appeal to as many people, as many consumers or customers as we can? So let's just start by talking about what supply and demand are. So demand, or the demand of a product, refers to the quantity of an item that consumers want to buy. So this is all about the consumers, right? If you ever say, or have ever heard that there's a high demand for iPhones or high demand for fidget spinners or something, this is it, right? They're flying off the shelf. Everybody wants to buy them. There's a high demand. Demand and price are inversely related, and what this means is that as price increases, demand decreases, and this should be pretty intuitive. Right, the more expensive something is, you're going to be less inclined to buy it. We're going to talk about cases where the price goes up and you still want to buy it, but that'll be later. In general, the more expensive something is, the less inclined you are to spend your hard-earned money on that thing. Well, we also have supply, and supply is exactly what it means in English, right? It's the quantity of an item, so we're still dealing with quantity, that is available to be sold. Right, so there's going to turn into this issue between how many things that the consumer wants to buy versus how many they actually have available to give to the consumers. Supply and price are directly related. And all that is to say is as price increases, so does supply. The more expensive something gets, the more that you will have available. You can already start to see the link. This link starts to exist between supply and demand, right? Because the demand drops, which means you have less of them being sold, you have more of them available to sell. So supply and demand can usually be modeled by linear regression. At least in our class, we will deal exclusively with linear supply and demand, but you can use other type of regression equations as well, right? You can use things like quadratic regression and all that fancy stuff like that. Whatever best fits the given data that you have to work with. And we can get this data through something called market research. You don't have to worry about that right now. We'll talk about that later on in the chapter. So let's start by talking about, if we're going to talk about modeling, we need to talk about functions, right? So if we have a demand function, that is simply just talking about a relationship between the demand of a product and its price. And we usually use Q, or this notation Q of P. Right, so this should remind you somewhat of f of x from algebra. We use Q for quantity, and P, of course, for price. The key is that the demand function will always have a negative slope. Right, so if I have, really quickly, just a graph here, it's showing my price and my quantity, I will always have a negative slope, something like this. Why is that? Well, again, going back to what we said before, as price increases, we notice that the demand starts to decrease. And that's exactly what that negative slope is showing, that loosely inverse relationship between demand and price. All this is, again, because a more expensive item usually means less demand, fewer people who want to buy that item. The biggest example I like to give, because this is always right around the time of the Apple event, is the iPhone. Right? Whatever new model I'm dealing with has some kind of a price point. And when that gets released, the old generation usually has a price cut. It's going to drop in price. Well, more people are then, in theory, going to want to buy this one because the price dropped. And usually there aren't a lot of big changes between generations. We will talk about the exceptions to this rule and why the brand new iPhones at $1,100 still fly off the shelf before they even reach the store. But generally speaking, more expensive, less demand. Less expensive, more demand. We have the same principle that we can apply to the supply function. And the supply function is just going to relate that's not what I want. Whoa, that's not what I wanted to highlight. It's going to relate the supply of a product to its price. And supply will always have a positive slope. So if I were to graph my supply function, so here's the supply, here's the price, and here's my supply, I will always have a nice positive slope. Again, why is that? Well, we just said, as price increases, so something becomes more expensive, we have more supply available because fewer people are buying it. So you can already start to see this connection. Right? Price increases, which means the supply does too. We don't really focus in this class on deriving or calculating a supply function, but it would work very much the same way as calculating a demand function would be. We would be able to use linear regression in order to do this. The problem now becomes this conflict between consumers who don't want to overpay for an item, while the manufacturers are businesses. Businesses want to make money, and they want to make as much money as they can. So what happens? Well, what happens is that my demand, the consumers, and the supply, my manufacturers, kind of act as checks and balances on each other. So, right, as let's consider the scenario of what happens when the price increases. Well, when the price increases, it's more expensive. I don't want to pay for it if it's more expensive, so the demand is going to decrease. Well, if the demand decreases, it just means that fewer people are buying. Fewer buying. And if fewer people buy the item off the shelf, then there's more supply left over to sell. So it would mean that the supply increases, more available on the shelf. So this is starting to become this check and balance on the two different types of supply and demand.